Hi guys, and welcome to Calm Night Radio channel. Tonight we step into a world that feels strangely unfinished, a place where the air is thick with salt, pine smoke, river mud, and human worry, and where a person might still hope for freedom while feeling it quietly slip away. What does it feel like to stand in 1660 and sense that something cruel is hardening around you, even if no one has fully named it yet? What happens when men in plain coats and muddy boots begin deciding that your life, your labour, your children, and even your future can be measured like barrels of tobacco? So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and while you are here, comment your location and your local time. Now, dim the lights, and you find yourself on the edge of an English colony in the Chesapeake, where the morning begins grey and wet, and nothing feels settled except hunger for land. The light arrives slowly here. Mist hangs over the river like a thin blanket, and the reeds near the bank tremble with insects. You hear water slap against a rough wooden landing. Somewhere nearby, a pig snorts in the mud. An axe strikes damp timber with a dull, patient rhythm. The colony smells of wet earth, sour beer, wood smoke, unwashed wool, and tobacco leaves drying in sheds. It is not grand. It is not elegant. It is a place of splinters, sweat, and stubborn ambition. You walk a narrow path between crude houses, some little more than timber frames packed with clay. The roofs sag, the fences lean. Chickens scratch at the ground as if they alone understand the terms of survival. English settlers move through the morning in heavy shoes and coarse linen shirts, shoulders bent from labour and caution. Their lives are difficult, and they do not let you forget it. They speak often of risk, loss, debt, fever, and harvests ruined by too much rain or too little. Everyone complains here. It seems to be one of the few crops that never fails, and among them, moving through the same damp, errant rough clearings, are black men, black women, and black children, some born in Africa, some already born in the colonies, some living in conditions that still carry the legal blur of servitude, and some trapped in bondage that is becoming harder, colder, and more permanent. That uncertainty is the strange thing. In 1660 the lines have not fully stopped moving, yet you can feel them stiffening. You notice it in the way people look at one another, and not just curiosity, measurement. A long, quiet calculation. Who works for whom? Who can be ordered? Who may testify? Who may own something? Who may marry freely? Who may run? Who may be hunted? In a colony like Virginia, labour is the great obsession. Tobacco has made the land valuable, and tobacco is greedy. It wants cleared fields, bent backs, skilled hands, endless repetition, planting, hoeing, topping, cutting, curing, packing. It asks for your mornings, your knees, your skin, your lungs. That labour system did not begin as a neat machine. It lurched into being. In earlier decades, many workers in English colonies were indentured servants from Europe, bound for a set term. A poor Englishman could sell years of his life in exchange for passage across the Atlantic. In theory, he might finish his term and receive freedom dues. In practice, disease, punishment, and plain bad luck often ruined that promise. Still, the idea of an ending existed, a horizon, a thin one, perhaps, but visible. For Africans brought into the colonies, the situation could be more varied in the early 17th century than many people now imagine. Some were treated in ways that resembled indentured servitude. A few gained freedom, a few acquired land, a few went to court. That does not mean life was fair. Far from it. It means only that the legal cage had not yet been fully sealed. Historians still argue whether the earlier status of Africans in English North America should be described as mixed labour arrangements or as slavery taking shape from the very start. wearing a less settled face. Either way, by 1660 the direction is becoming brutally clear. You feel that clarity in the colony's silence around certain questions. Not silence because no one notices. Silence because too many people benefit from pretending change is natural. A planter counts heads in a field and thinks about profit. A magistrate hears a dispute and thinks about order. A minister thinks about obedience, sin, and who should stand where inside a church. A neighbour watches another neighbour grow richer and learns what sort of labour makes that possible. No trumpets announce the transformation. No villain twirls a moustache under a thundercloud. It happens in paperwork, in punishments, in whispers, in the habit of seeing one kind of body as permanently available. You pass a tobacco field where the plants rise broad and sticky in the humidity. Their leaves brush against your sleeve with a rubbery softness. Workers move in rows under the sun, and the air grows heavier as the day warms. Gnats collect at the corners of eyes. Sweat crawls down spines. Fingers stain and roughen. The field is full of sounds that are almost small enough to ignore coughing. Insects, the scuff of feet, the snap of stems, the barked instruction of an overseer or master. Yet together they form a world. A world where the body is always being claimed by work. A black woman stoops to gather what must be gathered. Her hands move with practiced speed. Her face gives little away. Nearby, a young man carries tools across uneven ground. He is watched, not constantly, but enough. Watchfulness itself is becoming part of the structure. You begin to understand that freedom here is not only about papers. It is about breathing without surveillance. It is about walking without someone deciding your purpose for you. Some free black people do exist in this world. That fact matters because it reveals the uncertainty of the moment. The colony has not yet erased every alternative. In records from the period, a few Africans and their descendants appear as landholders, property owners, litigants, taxpayers. Anthony Johnson is one of the best-known examples, a man of African descent who gained freedom and owned land in Virginia. His life reminds you that 1660 sits inside a shifting landscape rather than a finished script. But his story is not a cheerful loophole. It is almost more haunting than that. It shows a path that briefly existed while the road around it was being quietly barricaded. The colony is full of contradictions like that. English settlers speak of liberty while demanding control. They complain about tyranny from distant authorities while building intimate tyrannies at home. They invoke Christian duty while allowing greed to set the tempo of daily life. They fear native resistance, fear disease, fear starvation, fear rebellion, fear servants slipping away into the woods, fear one another's success. Fear is everywhere. It smells like damp wool and gunpowder. It sounds like a door bar dropped into place at night. And fear changes societies faster than philosophy. A frightened planter wants a labour force that cannot leave. A frightened official wants categories that simplify punishment. A frightened colony prefers hierarchy to ambiguity. Skin colour becomes useful in that grim arithmetic. Not because prejudice is new in 1660, it is already present, ugly and real. But now prejudice is being fitted with legal nails and economic beams. It is becoming architecture. You step into a small settlement lane where children chase each other with shrill laughter, then stop short when an adult calls. A dog noses at a pile of oyster shells. Laundry stiffens on a line in the breeze. Life continues with ordinary details. And that is part of the horror. Systems of cruelty do not arrive in dramatic costume each morning. They settle into chores. They hide in a routine. Someone fetches water. Someone needs bread. Someone patches a shirt. Someone is sold, or denied a right, or punished more harshly than another person for the same act. Then supper is cooked. Then the sun goes down. Human beings can normalize almost anything, which is not exactly an uplifting bedtime thought, but it is a true one. Inside a modest dwelling, the air is close and smoky. You smell boiled cornmeal, salt fish, and damp straw. The floor is packed dirt, A stool wobbles under a chipped bowl. Here, conversation lowers. People do not waste words when words may travel. A black labourer might know several languages or fragments of them, carried across ocean routes and colonial encounters. An English servant might curse the gentry back home, while still clinging fiercely to one small advantage over someone darker than himself. An indigenous trader might appear at the edge of the settlement with goods, news, and unreadable patience. Worlds overlap in these colonies, though not on equal terms. There are also fragments of culture that refuse to vanish. A rhythm tapped on wood, a cooking method adapted to new ingredients, a pattern of braiding, a prayer spoken softly at dusk, a name remembered even when others try to rename you. These things are easy for authorities to dismiss because they do not look like grand rebellion, yet they hold identity in place. They tell a person, quietly, that you're not only what the colony calls you. One quirky detail from 17th century colonial life would almost be funny if everything around it were not so severe. Tobacco at times functioned like money. Debts, wages, even fines could be reckoned in pounds of leaf. Imagine living where your entire legal universe smells faintly of a drying barn. It would be absurd if it were not so consequential. When tobacco prices shifted, leaves shifted with them. More demand for labour meant more pressure to define labour as controllable property. Economics, as usual, arrived dressed as practicality and left carrying chains. Religion adds another layer. Many English colonists think carefully about baptism, salvation, and the soul, but not always in ways that offer protection. You might assume that conversion to Christianity would clearly open the door to better treatment. Some people do argue that shared faith should complicate enslavement. Others work around the problem with impressive moral flexibility, which is a polite way of saying they bend religion until it stops interfering with profit. The colony is not short on spiritual language. It is short on mercy. As the day moves on, the heat presses harder. Cicadas whine from the trees. The river smells metallic and green. Sweat dries salty on your neck, then returns. Work does not pause because the air is cruel. In that endless demand, you sense what is really disappearing. Not only legal freedom for some black colonists, though that matters profoundly. What is fading is the possibility that this society might choose a less vicious shape. With each year, each case, each local custom, each act of convenience, the colony leans toward hereditary racial slavery. The people living through it may not all grasp the full future. That is another unsettling truth. You can stand at the edge of a disaster without seeing its final size. A mother worries about today's meal. A labourer worries about punishment this week. A magistrate worries about the next dispute on his table. Yet the pattern is forming beneath all of them. A child born to a black mother may inherit not hope but status imposed by others. The body itself is being drafted into law. Even the landscape seems to absorb the tension. Forests loom beyond the fields, dense and watchful. Marshes breathe mist at evening. Paths vanish into thickets where runaways might hide, starve, or perhaps find help. The colony is unfinished ground, but its rulers crave fixed order, so they create it where they can, on paper, in courts, through force, through memory, through repetition. When dusk settles, smoke rises blue from cook fires and the world softens at the edges. Frogs begin calling from the water. The heat loosens its grip a little. For a brief moment, everything seems quieter than it truly is. You hear spoons against bowls, low voices, a baby fussing, night insects taking over the air. It would be easy, from a distance, to mistake this for simple frontier life. But beneath the ordinary evening sounds, a harsher society is being assembled piece by piece. One decision at a time, one rule at a time, one stolen possibility at a time, and you, standing in 1660, can feel the hinge turning. The colony still contains traces of uncertainty, traces of movement, traces of lives that do not fit the categories men are trying to impose. But those traces are under pressure now. Pressure from profit, pressure from fear, pressure from the desire to make inequality permanent and call it order. The night smells of ash and river grass. The stars appear above the dark trees. Somewhere, out in the settlement, a voice begins to sing very softly, almost too softly to hear. It carries through the warm dark for a moment, delicate and steady. Then the sound fades, and the colony holds its breath. Morning begins with damp sleeves and a stiff back. You wake before the light fully forms, while the sky is still a pale blur above the trees and the air feels cool only by colonial standards, which is to say not cool at all. The sleeping place is close, crowded, and sour with old smoke, damp straw, and the faint animal smell of bodies that worked too hard the day before. Someone shifts beside you. Someone coughs into the dark. Then comes the sound that rules everything here, movement starting again. A door opens, hinges complain, bare feet meet packed earth. A rooster announces himself with heroic confidence, as though he personally invented dawn. Outside, the river gives off a wet mineral smell mixed with rotting reeds and fish. Mist drifts low over the water. It looks peaceful from a distance. It is not peaceful. The river is a road, a marketplace, a boundary, and a threat. It carries boats, tobacco, gossip, tools, punishments, people sold away, and dreams of escape that may or may not survive the current. You step into the yard and feel the earth soft underfoot. The ground here never seems entirely dry. Everything holds moisture. Wood swells. Clothes cling. Mud grips at shoes and hems. Nearby, a cooking pot hangs over coals, and the first meal is plain, practical, and never enough to feel generous. Cornmeal, perhaps, a little salted meat if fortune has wandered close. The smell is filling for a moment and then frustrating, because hunger in these colonies never really leaves. It merely steps aside and waits. The day is already decided for you long before the sun rises. Labour is the centre of colonial life in the Chesapeake, especially in places tied to tobacco. Men who speak grandly about opportunity usually mean opportunity for themselves, preferably built on somebody else's exhaustion. Fields must be cleared, stumps pulled, soil broken, seedlings planted, weeds cut, leaves watched, leaves topped, leaves picked, leaves cured, leaves packed. It is a crop that demands constant attention and repays care with money, which means planters learn to see time itself as a thing they can own in other people. You walk toward the fields with others, the path narrow and marked by ruts from carts. Pine resin warms in the growing light and gives off a sharp scent. Mosquitoes rise from damp places and begin their little reign of irritation. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a bird calls once and then again. The sound is clear and bright, almost cheerful. The humans are less cheerful. No one wastes much energy on chatter this early. There will be enough commands later. The tobacco plants stand in disciplined rows, wide-leaved and greedy. Their surfaces feel sticky when touched, and they brush against your arms with a softness that becomes unpleasant within seconds. The field holds heat like a grudge. By mid-morning, the sun presses down hard enough to make the back of your neck sting. Sweat slips under collars, into eyes, down wrists. Dirt cakes along fingers and inside every crease of the hand. This is repetitive labour, but it is not simple labour. People must know when to thin, when to top, how to handle leaves without ruining their value. A planter may look at a worker and see only muscle, yet the crop itself demands skill. That is one of the quiet lies of this world. Colonists often speak as though black labourers are merely bodies to command, but the entire plantation economy depends on their knowledge, endurance, and adaptation. They learn the soil, the seasons, the tools, the moods of the weather, the timing of harvest, the tricks that save a crop from damage. The colony rarely rewards this wisdom fairly. It simply consumes it. Skill does not guarantee dignity here. It only increases what can be extracted from you. Not all labour happens in the open field. That would be too tidy, and the colony is never tidy. Some people cut timber in the woods, where the smell of fresh sap mixes with sweat and iron. Some tend livestock, sloshing through pens and mud, listening to pigs grunt and hens scold. Some row goods along creeks and rivers, shoulders straining with each pull. Some cook, wash, mend, haul water, shape clay, build fences, or cure tobacco in barns where the air turns warm, dry, and heavy with the thick scent of leaf. Women often carry double burdens, expected to work hard in production and hard again in domestic labour, all while receiving less recognition than anyone seems prepared to admit. There is no elegant division here. Work spills everywhere. A black woman bends over a wash kettle while steam rises around her face. Her arms glisten in the heat. Cloth slaps against wood. Soap, smoke, and river water combine into a smell both clean and rough. Nearby, a child is set to a smaller task, fetching, carrying, learning the shape of obedience through repetition. Childhood narrows quickly in colonial settings. You can almost watch it shrink. The labouring day is structured by light, weather, and supervision. A master may be present, an overseer may be present. Sometimes neither stands close, yet authority remains, lodged in routine and threat. You feel it in the way shoulders tighten when someone approaches. You hear it in the difference between natural conversation and careful conversation. A person under watch learns to divide the self. Hands perform one role, eyes perform another. The inner life goes elsewhere, where it can. The river keeps appearing at the edge of this existence. Flatboats move along brown water carrying barrels and bundles. Oars dip with a repeated splash that becomes almost hypnotic. If you stand near the landing, you hear ropes drag against wood, hear men calling measurements and warnings, hear the dull knock of casks being shifted into place. Tobacco leaves these shores because distant markets hunger for it. In that simple fact lies a whole empire of discomfort. European consumers enjoy the habit. Colonial merchants count their gain. Meanwhile, the people who bend in the fields feel the full cost in their wrists, lungs, and backs. One curious detail of 17th century labour is that tools could be precious enough to appear in estate inventories with notable importance. Hoes, axes, iron pots, cooper's tools, even worn farming gear mattered because they made extraction possible. A broken hoe was not just an inconvenience. It interrupted profit. In a world that valued output so heavily, even objects developed a kind of harsh social rank. Some planters seem to care for a tobacco knife more reliably than for the hands holding it. Human beings notice that sort of thing, naturally. Heat changes everything by midday. The insects grow louder. The smell of plants intensifies. Shirts stick to skin with a clammy patience. Salt dries at the edge of the lips. The body enters that state where each motion continues only because it has already begun. Bend, lift, cut, carry, turn, bend again. It is almost a kind of trance, except trances usually sound more relaxing. This one comes with aching joints and the occasional shouted correction. Yet even under strain, people find ways to observe one another, to exchange fragments of comfort, warning, or humour. A glance can say plenty. A muttered phrase can carry more kindness than a full sermon from the colony's worthies. Gentle sarcasm survives here too, though it must wear quiet shoes. Somebody mutters about a master's great wisdom, while the master misjudges the weather yet again. Somebody notes that a man who owns 50 acres somehow cannot locate his own gloves. The joke is small. Small is safer. Still, it keeps a little piece of the self unbroken. Historians still dispute how much day-to-day autonomy workers in different Chesapeake settings could exercise during this period, because labour arrangements varied by household, wealth, crop cycle, and local custom. Some scholars emphasize brutal regimentation. Others point out moments of negotiated practice, especially in smaller farms where labourers known as worked in close proximity. Both views can be true at once. Colonial life was inconsistent in its details and relentless in its hierarchy. The structure bent here and there. It did not become kind. Meals interrupt the day without softening it. Food is eaten quickly, often standing or crouched, with little ceremony. Coarse bread, porridge, beans, fish, perhaps peas. The smell is earthy and plain. Hunger sharpens the senses so much that even simple food seems briefly luxurious. Then the bowl is empty and the field waits like a creditor. You notice something else in the rhythm of work. Time is political. Every moment claimed for rest. Conversation, prayer, memory, or private thought is a moment not fully surrendered to the plantation. That is why owners try to regulate movement and pace so closely. A person who controls another person's hours is already halfway to controlling their future. The disappearance of freedom can sound abstract in law books. In daily life, it often sounds like this: get up, move, faster, there is more to do. The weather is its own ruler. Summer sun punishes. Autumn brings harvest pressure. Winter does not make labour vanish, only change shape. Fences need mending. Wood must be cut. Animals still require care. Tools need repair. Clothing must be patched against the cold. The colony does not offer a season in which the labouring poor can become decorative. There are no leisurely months. There is only different discomfort. On some days, storms roll in with terrifying speed. Clouds gather over the river, heavy and greenish. Wind shivers through the tobacco leaves. Then rain comes hard, drumming on roofs, turning paths to slick clay, flattening noise under its force. For a few minutes everyone pauses, not from generosity but from necessity. Steam rises afterward from the earth. Clothing clings colder now. Work resumes. Of course it does. A young black man carries water buckets from the riverbank, the wooden handles biting into his palms. He sets them down with care because spilled water means another trip. Nearby, an older labourer trims leaves in a curing shed, where dim light filters through slats and the air smells rich, bitter, and almost sweet. The leaves rustle dryly, like paper being handled in a library no one is allowed to enjoy. You realise how many textures define this world. Wet mud, splintered wood, coarse linen, rope, ash, leaf, callus. The colony can almost be understood through touch alone. There are labourers who know bits of carpentry, herding, fishing, healing, cooking, or navigation. Some knowledge comes from Africa, some from Europe, some from indigenous communities, some from grim experience in the colonies themselves. The plantation world likes to pretend it produces order from above, but much of its actual survival depends on skills gathered from below. That truth remains strangely durable. A man with authority may issue commands all day and still have no idea which herb eases a fever or which patch of soil drains properly after rain. Power and competence are not twins. They merely rent the same room now and then. At evening, the field finally loosens its grip. Shadows lengthen. The sharp smell of crushed leaves fades into the broader scent of smoke and water. Birds settle. Frogs begin their steady calling from marshy places. The body does not so much stop working as slowly remember it has limits. Ankles throb, fingers stiffen, lower backs burn with a dull, familiar ache. This is the hour when fatigue wraps around people like another garment, and still there are chores: fire to build, clothes to rinse, food to stir, children to quiet, a torn seam to repair in bad light. The settlement glows in patches where cooking fires catch. Sparks rise and disappear into the dark. Someone hums under their breath. Someone tells a story in fragments while scraping out a pot. Someone sits silently, saving energy for tomorrow because tomorrow will ask for all of it. The colony's economy rests on days like this, repeated until they feel natural, repeated until some men forget they were ever choices. That is how unfreedom grows, not only through dramatic decrees, but through the normalization of endless extraction. A field is planted, a river carries its cargo, a ledger notes profit. Meanwhile, people give the hours of their lives to a system that increasingly plans to keep those hours forever. The night air feels softer on your skin, though the heat still lingers in the boards and soil. Fire smoke curls sweet and dry through the dark. Crickets begin their patient music. You look out toward the river, now a dim ribbon under a bruised sky, and hear the faint knock of wood against wood from a tide boat shifting in the current. Labour is done for the day. Labour is never done. That is the lesson the colony repeats until it sounds like nature, though it is only power dressed in work clothes. By the time the sun lifts above the tree line, the settlement is already listening to itself. You hear paddles touching water in a patient rhythm from the creek. You hear an English voice calling for a lost pig, as if the pig has entered a moral dispute. You hear the creak of leather, the snap of kindling, the restless wing beats of fowl scattering from a yard. Life in the colony is never truly quiet. Even when people lower their voices, the place itself keeps talking through water, wood, mud, and wind. You move along a track worn by feet, cartwheels, and weather, and the path leads you into a world where different peoples live close enough to affect one another every day, yet far enough apart in power, language, and trust to keep misunderstanding alive. English settlers, black labourers and families, and indigenous communities all inhabit this landscape. They trade with one another, borrow from one another, fear one another, use one another, and sometimes depend on one another in ways no one likes to say too plainly. It is not a neat frontier painting, it is an uneasy human knot. The first thing you notice is proximity. Houses stand near fields, fields near woods, woods near waterways, and waterways near villages or temporary camps that may not appear on any English map worth the name. A person can wake to church bells in one direction, and the smell of fish smoke from another. A person can hear English curses at a landing, and then catch a word or phrase from an African language, or an Algonquian one carried on the air like a secret. The colony is crowded not by numbers alone, but by overlapping worlds. An English planter likes to imagine he is master of a tidy domain. Reality is less flattering. He may own land on paper, but the land itself remembers other uses and other claims. Forest paths do not care about deeds. Rivers do not respect fence lines. Nearby indigenous people know the creeks, marshes, and trails with a confidence most newcomers lack. Black labourers learn the terrain quickly too, because survival often depends on reading the land better than the people who command you, knowing where fresh water lies, where trees thicken, where boats are tied, where dogs lose a scent. All of that becomes a quiet form of literacy. You come to a small landing where men handle baskets, barrels, and bundles with a solemn fussiness usually reserved for church silver. A canoe rests low in the water. A small English boat knocks gently against the dock. Trade is happening here, though not with any grand flourish. Few animal skins, corn, fish, tobacco, metal goods, cloth, perhaps beads, tools, or powder when permitted. Exchange in the 17th century often looks less like an official market and more like a tense conversation with objects in the middle. An indigenous trader stands with a posture that gives nothing away. His clothing carries the scent of smoke and travel. Near him, an English settler squints as if suspicion improves his eyesight. A black man unloads goods under instruction, though his eyes miss very little. Nobody is fully relaxed. That is one of the most reliable features of colonial contact. Everyone is aware that trade can help, but it can also expose weakness, a bad harvest, a fever, a stolen tool, a rumour of attack, a dispute over debt. All of it can turn yesterday's useful acquaintance into today's danger. The smell near the landing is thick with river mud, scales, wet rope, and tobacco casks. Flies gather where fish have been cleaned. Sunlight glints on the water and makes everybody look slightly suspicious, which feels appropriate. Children linger nearby until chased off by adults who prefer their bargains without commentary. A dog noses at a pile of reeds and sneezes. Somewhere, someone laughs once, briefly. Even tension gets tired and lets a little sound escape. In this world, daily life forces people into contact whether they welcome it or not. English settlers need food sources beyond what they can immediately produce. They need local knowledge. They need trade routes. Black labourers may encounter indigenous communities through work, travel, escape attempts, or shared spaces at the edge of settlements. Indigenous people monitor English expansion while calculating which forms of exchange are useful, which are tolerable, and which invite trouble. Nobody's standing outside history here. Everyone is improvising within it. Some encounters are practical rather than dramatic. A black woman carrying laundry to the water's edge may exchange a few words with an indigenous woman gathering reeds or shellfish nearby. Their conversation might be brief, cautious, and shaped by limited shared language, yet still meaningful. They may compare the weather with the seriousness weather deserves. They may note a sick child, a swollen creek, a missing chicken, a patch of herbs that help settle a stomach. Colonial records rarely linger on these small moments, which is a pity, because ordinary contact can reveal more about a society than its loudest proclamations. Historians still disagree about the scale and nature of alliances between Africans and indigenous peoples in early English America, partly because written evidence often comes from colonists who misunderstood, ignored, or deliberately obscured those relationships. Some scholars emphasize shared vulnerability and cooperation, especially in flight or trade. Others caution that these relationships varied sharply by region, circumstance, and politics within indigenous communities themselves. That uncertainty matters. It reminds you that the archive is not a window with clean glass. It is warped, cracked, and usually owned by the least trustworthy man in the room. The English, meanwhile, are busy sorting everyone into categories that suit their own ambitions. They distinguish ally from enemy among indigenous groups when it benefits them. They distinguish servant from slave among labourers when profit requires it. They distinguish Christian from non-Christian, civilised from savage, free from unfree, and then shift those boundaries whenever convenient. Colonial language is full of confidence and full of elastic trickery. A man can use one set of words in church and another in court and sleep very soundly afterward. You walk beyond the landing and into a patch of settlement where cooking fires send up thin grey ribbons. The smell of maize porridge drifts from one place, while another yard carries the sharper scent of salted meat and onions. A child with a runny nose clutches a wooden spoon like a sceptre of office. Nearby, two English women speak in low voices while glancing toward the woods. Their concern might be about theft, or illness, or local tensions with neighbouring tribes, or simply the fact that uncertainty has become the default setting of their lives. Colonies attract grand speeches, but they run on nerves. Black people in this setting must navigate several kinds of danger at once. English authority is immediate and often brutal. Indigenous communities may represent possible refuge, possible exchange, or possible risk depending on the local situation. Other Europeans drift through the region with their own intentions, their own languages, and their own capacity for violence. To survive, you learn to read tone, gesture, rumour, and landscape with exhausting precision. You learn who drinks too much and grows reckless. You learn who might sell information. You learn which creek crossing is passable after rain. You learn that a smile can mean kindness, mockery, or calculation. And sometimes all three at once. One quirky truth about early colonial contact zones is how often people borrowed material culture, while loudly insisting on their difference. English settlers adopted indigenous food knowledge, local travel methods, and sometimes clothing choices suited to the climate, all while assuring one another of English superiority. The human talent for copying and condescension at the same time is, apparently, timeless. A settler may sneer at local expertise with one breath and rely on it with the next. Pride and dependence make very awkward roommates. Language barriers shape everything. Even simple exchanges require patience, gestures, guessed meaning, repeated terms, or interpreters who hold more power than anyone admits. A translator can soften a threat, sharpen an insult, conceal a detail, or save a life. The colony is full of half-understood conversations, and half-understood conversations are dangerous things. A rumour born from mistranslation can move through a settlement faster than a boat on the tide. You reach a place where the path narrows beside thick woods. The air turns cooler under the trees. Pine needles soften your steps. The smell here is resin, damp bark, and leaf rot. Hidden in such places are routes invisible to newcomers but well known to those who need to move unseen. For black people considering escape, indigenous territory might appear as hope, mystery, or peril. Some runaways found aid, some were captured, some entered communities in ways the English barely understood. Others vanished from the record entirely, which may be tragic or may be the nearest thing to victory the archive allows. Not every interaction is cooperative. Raids, retaliation, theft, and coercion shape the borderlands of colonial life. The English fear attack, indigenous communities fear encroachment, kidnapping, and deceit disguised as diplomacy. Black labourers fear being trapped between competing powers with little control over the outcome. When violence erupts, ordinary people carry the memory in their bodies long after officials summarise it in stiff prose. You notice how often adults pause to scan tree lines, how quickly doors are barred at night, how frequently muskets are checked, repaired, and discussed with an almost religious seriousness. There is also intimacy in this crowded world. Though it rarely fits the stories officials prefer, children observe one another across distances adults try to enforce. Foodways mix in kitchens and campfires. Healing practices travel by whisper and demonstration. A remedy for fever, a method of smoking fish, a way to weave mats or baskets, a trick for preserving seeds. These things move between people because they are useful, and usefulness can cross boundaries faster than ideology. Survival is persuasive that way. At the edge of a field, you see an older indigenous woman handing a bundle of gathered plants to a younger black woman, whose face shows worry and fatigue. No ceremony marks the exchange. Perhaps it is payment, perhaps it is kindness, perhaps it is both, because humans rarely separate those as neatly as historians wish. The leaves smell bitter and green. The younger woman tucks them away carefully. A sick child may sleep easier tonight because knowledge travelled where official power did not. Religious life offers another complicated meeting ground. English ministers preach order and salvation, but their message lands unevenly across a mixed colonial world. Some black people encounter Christianity through coercion, some through curiosity, some through practical necessity, some through selective adaptation. Indigenous communities respond with their own range of acceptance, resistance, and reinterpretation depending on local circumstances. The result is not one clean spiritual map, but many overlapping forms of belief and ritual. A whispered prayer in one language may rise under a sky that has already heard 3 others that day. By late afternoon, the settlement seems to hold more shadows than open space. Smoke settles low, a breeze carries marsh scent and the far-off cry of birds circling water. Men at the landing finish their business with gestures that look polite from a distance and guarded up close. A cartwheel sinks into mud and sparks a stream of complaints, inventive enough to deserve preservation. Nearby, a small group of children play some game involving pebbles and sticks. For a few minutes they share rules faster than adults share trust. Then a parent calls, and the lines return. This is what uneasy neighbouring looks like in 1660. Not constant battle, not harmonious blending, something stranger and more human. Suspicion beside necessity, borrowing beside contempt, curiosity beside fear, all of it carried out in places that smell of smoke, fish, wet leaves, sweat, and river wind. The colony does not permit anyone the luxury of simplicity. As evening settles, you stand where the path meets the water and watch the light thin across the surface of the creek. The air cools just enough to feel like mercy. Frogs start their rough music. An owl calls from deeper woods behind you. English households close themselves in with bars, prayers, and private anxieties. Across the darkening landscape, other people keep their own watch in their own ways. The distance between communities is real. So is the fact that they breathe the same humid air and live inside the same unstable world. You begin to understand that colonial society is not only built by laws and labour, it is also shaped by proximity under pressure. People do not merely meet here, they test one another, use one another, study one another, and sometimes help one another in ways the official record will never gracefully admit. The night gathers over river and forest alike. Smoke lingers in your hair and clothes. Somewhere beyond sight, a paddle touches water once, then again, and the sound slips into the dark like a thought no one once overheard. The law does not arrive wearing a grand robe and carrying a trumpet. In 1660 it often looks more disappointing than that. It looks like a table, a bench, a few papers, some men with stern faces, and a room that smells of ink, damp wool, mud, and impatience. Yet inside such plain spaces, entire futures are sorted. A person's life can narrow here with almost no drama at all. You make your way toward a county court day, and the path grows busier as you approach. Men come on horseback, on foot, by boat, and with carts that creak under sacks, tools, and complaints. Everybody seems to have a grievance, a debt, a boundary line, a witness, or a cousin who has done something regrettable. Colonial courts are not distant marble temples. They are busy little machines for managing property, labour, punishment, and status. That last one matters most today. The yard outside the meeting place is noisy with waiting. Horses stamp and flick their tails. Flies gather in the heat. Tobacco smoke hangs low around clusters of men speaking in short, guarded bursts. An English servant in worn linen shifts his weight and keeps glancing toward the doorway. A planter with polished boots tries to look patient and fails. Nearby, a black man stands still enough to seem calm, though the stillness itself has effort inside it. Everyone is measuring everyone else. Inside, the air is close and warm. The room has rough walls, a table scarred by use, and benches that do not believe in comfort. Light comes in unevenly through small openings, catching dust in the air. Papers rest in stacks and folds, their surfaces carrying decisions that will outlast most of the people speaking over them. The men handling those papers are not abstract symbols of justice. They are neighbours, landowners, creditors, planters, and local officials. They know one another. They borrow from one another. They sit in judgment within a society that benefits from their judgment looking respectable. What makes this world so unsettling is that legal status for black people has not yet become fully uniform in 1660. That uncertainty creates both danger and occasional openings. Some Africans and people of African descent are treated as servants for a term, at least in local practice. Some have already been pushed into lifetime bondage. Some are free and attempt to defend that freedom in court through property claims, contracts, or testimony shaped by local custom. The line between servant and slave exists, but it is being redrawn in harder ink. You can feel that instability in the cases people discuss while waiting. A dispute over whether a term of service has ended, an argument about a child's status, a complaint about a runaway, a conflict over wages, labour, or ownership. These cases are not mere technicalities. They are the battleground where colonial society decides who can hope for release and who will be trapped without end. Historians still argue over how quickly English colonial law in places like Virginia moved from mixed and inconsistent labour categories to a more rigid, racialised system. Some stress the piecemeal nature of the shift, with local cases and customs shaping the outcome before statutes fully hardened it. Others emphasise that violence, exploitation, and a slaving mentality were present early, even when terminology remained loose. Both views point you toward the same truth. Ambiguity did not mean safety. It meant vulnerability to whatever decision powerful men found most useful. A clerk reads out names in a voice that flattens everybody into the same tone. Debts, assaults, property lines, bastardy cases, indenture disputes, probate matters. Human mess enters the room and gets translated into formula. When black people appear in these proceedings, the room subtly changes, attention sharpens. The question beneath the question becomes visible. Is this person to be recognised as having a claim, or only as someone who can be claimed? A free black person in the Chesapeake might own a cow, lease land, complete a contract, or seek recognition of rights that earlier decades had not entirely denied. There were such people. Their existence matters because it reveals that the colony still contained a narrow, contested space where Africans and their descendants could maneuver within English law. Yet the space was fragile. A right defended today could be narrowed tomorrow by a new ruling, a suspicious magistrate, or a statute designed to erase uncertainty. One of the most revealing features of court life is how much depends on reputation. A man's word carries weight if local authorities consider him respectable. Respectability, naturally, tends to gather around property, whiteness, church standing, and useful friendships. A black litigant may know the facts perfectly, and still face a room that treats his voice as a problem rather than evidence. The law loves to describe itself as orderly. It is actually full of human bias wearing a tidy collar. You sit through a dispute involving service. The details are tedious on the surface, but the implications are not. A labour term should have ended, someone argues. Another insists more years are owed because of misconduct, travel costs, or some conveniently remembered obligation. This sort of stretching happened to many indentured servants of all backgrounds. Time could be added as punishment for running away, for pregnancy, for alleged disobedience, for losses blamed on the servant. But for black labourers, the risk was growing more severe. Extra years could slide into lifetime service. A delayed freedom could become freedom denied altogether. The room smells of sweat, parchment, candle wax, and damp wood. Boots scrape. A fly lands on the clerk's sleeve and survives longer than logic suggests. One magistrate leans back as if bored, which is perhaps the cruelest posture of all when someone else's future is being weighed. Another asks questions in that smooth manner officials use when they have already guessed which answer they prefer. Outside the formal hearing, people trade stories about earlier cases. A black man who secured recognition of his freedom, a mixed-race child whose status caused dispute, an owner who produced a paper nobody had seen before, a servant who disappeared into the woods and was dragged back half-starved. The colony keeps memory alive through gossip as much as through records. Sometimes gossip preserves hope. More often it teaches caution. There is a strange irony here. English colonists are proud of law. They speak of rights, contracts, procedure, inheritance, and proper order with almost devotional energy. Yet many of them are quite willing to manipulate those very tools to make black dependency more permanent. The legal system does not merely reflect social prejudice, it organises it. It takes personal greed and turns it into precedent. A well-known example from the earlier decades of Virginia is Anthony Johnson, a man of African descent who gained freedom, acquired land, and even went to court over labour claims. His story shows how fluid the early colonial world could be. It also shows how grim that fluidity could become. Success inside the system did not guarantee security from the system's wider transformation. A few exceptional lives could exist while the broader legal order moved toward racial slavery with chilling efficiency. One quirky detail of colonial courts is how physically public many punishments and decisions could become. This was not a world of private paperwork alone. Whippings, extensions of service, public declarations, fines in tobacco, and visible humiliation all helped turn law into theatre. The authorities wanted people to see consequences, to absorb hierarchy through the body as well as the mind, justice, if you're feeling charitable, performance, if you're feeling accurate. You begin to notice that legal uncertainty itself can be useful to those in power. If the category is unclear, the person under scrutiny must prove what others simply assume about themselves. A white servant nearing the end of a term might still suffer abuse, but the concept of eventual release was legible within English custom. A black servant or labourer faced a more dangerous question. Would the colony treat your term as finite at all, or quietly shift you into permanence because doing so suited local interests? When ambiguity leans in only one direction, it is no longer innocent confusion. The people most at risk learn to read tiny signals. Which magistrate avoids your gaze? Which witness is willing to speak clearly? Which planter suddenly remembers a detail when money is at stake? Which minister mutters about heathenism as though theology were a receipt? Survival in such a world requires legal awareness without legal protection. An exhausting combination. You must know the rules and the ways they can be bent against you. Women face another layer of danger. Sexual exploitation, coercion, and disputes over the status of children increasingly become part of the legal landscape. Colonial lawmakers and local courts start looking closely at descent, parentage, and the reproductive future of bondage. A child's status is no longer just a family matter. It is becoming an economic calculation. That shift is cold enough on paper. In lived experience, it is terrifying. A black mother in this setting may understand that her own condition can determine the fate of her child regardless of affection, baptism, or any claim of fairness. That knowledge sits inside daily life like a stone. You carry water, you stir the pot, you mend a shirt, you hear a rooster crow and a dog bark and a baby fuss. And all the while the law is quietly circling your household with a measuring stick. Not every court day produces defeat for black claimants. That is what makes this period so morally dizzying. There are moments when a contract is recognised, when freedom is acknowledged, when property rights are recorded, when a grievance at least enters the official ear. But each such moment exists inside a system that is learning, case by case, how to close those openings. Small victories can occur even while the structure turns hostile. The room empties and fills again through the day. A boundary line dispute, a theft complaint, a probate inventory listing kettles, stools, livestock, tools, and human beings in neighbouring categories. That last part lands like a chill. The colony has not yet standardised every legal definition, but its habits are revealing its future. The more often black people are treated as assets in practice, the easier it becomes for lawmakers to formalise that treatment later. By afternoon, the heat has made tempers shorter, ink dries faster, faces shine with sweat. Someone argues over tobacco owed as a fine. And for one absurd moment, the entire room seems prepared to collapse into righteous indignation over leaf. Colonial life had a remarkable ability to turn plant matter into philosophy. Yet beneath such quarrels lies a harsher matter. Who belongs to themselves? The court may never phrase it so plainly, but that is the question under nearly every serious dispute involving black labour. You step outside for air and find the yard alive with waiting again. A woman hushes a child with one hand while keeping her eyes on the door. Two men whisper for whether a witness can be trusted. A black labourer stares toward the road, jaw set, as if looking long enough might produce a different verdict by sheer force of annoyance. The sunlight feels brutal after the dim room. The smell of horse sweat and trampled grass is sharp and strangely cleansing. In these colonies, Freedom is not disappearing in a single dramatic seizure. It is being trimmed, delayed, disputed, qualified, and redefined until only a few narrow routes remain. A term becomes unclear, a child inherits status, a baptism changes nothing, a testimony counts less, a custom hardens into expectation, a local ruling becomes a habit. The law inches toward a conclusion that labour-hungry colonists have wanted all along. As evening approaches, officials gather papers with the casual confidence of men who believe order has been maintained. Perhaps, by their definition, it has. But outside the court's wooden walls, the consequences continue walking around in flesh and breath. A person leaves with freedom confirmed, though not secure. Another leaves with service extended. Another leaves with no answer at all, which may be the most dangerous outcome, because uncertainty gives power room to keep inventing itself. The sky softens toward dusk. Crickets begin their patient work in the grass. Wagons roll away. Boats push from the landing with small groans of wood and rope. The smell of evening smoke starts rising from scattered homes. Behind you, the court stands plain and almost forgettable. Yet inside that plain building, words have been arranging lives into categories, and the categories are growing colder. A bench, a table, a few papers. That is often how an age decides who can still hope to walk free. You notice it first in the stare, not the quick glance of curiosity, and not the simple habit of looking at whoever passes by, but the longer stare that sorts a person before a word is spoken. In 1660, skin is becoming a kind of shorthand in the English colonies, a visible sign that people with power increasingly treat as destiny. The change is not finished. It does not yet cover every corner with equal force, but it is gathering shape, and you can feel it in the smallest encounters, where a face, a tone, or a pause at a doorway says more than the law has fully written down. The morning air carries the smell of damp soil, chimney smoke, and stale beer from the settlement. A dog noses through refuse near a fence. 2 children kick at pebbles until an older woman calls them away. A cartwheel sinks into soft ground with a wet sucking sound, and the man hauling it mutters to himself with the tragic dignity of a philosopher betrayed by mud. Ordinary life continues, yet even the ordinary is starting to sort itself along a harsher line. You walk toward a cluster of buildings used for trade, storage, and local business. Men gather there with ledgers, sacks, tools, and the perpetual colonial expression of mild grievance. Their coats smell of wool, sweat, and tobacco dust. A black man approaches carrying goods for delivery, and the mood alters by a degree so small it could be missed if you were not paying attention. Space opens around him. Voices shift. Instructions become sharper. Nobody announces a theory of race. They do something more effective. They act it out. That is how the weight of skin grows in a society before every statute is settled. It enters custom, posture, and expectation. It follows you into work, into worship, into punishment, into commerce. It decides who is presumed honest and who is presumed suspect. It decides whose fatigue looks human and whose fatigue looks useful. By the time laws catch up, the habits may already be old enough to feel natural. English colonists did not invent prejudice in 1660, and they certainly did not arrive as blank slates. They brought old hierarchies with them, old religious hostilities, old assumptions about rank, blood, and belonging. What changes in this world is the increasing effort to attach African descent to a permanent lower status within colonial life. The body becomes evidence before any act is considered. Blackness is made to carry meanings imposed from outside, and those meanings begin to spread through every institution that likes to pretend it is merely being practical. You see it at a market exchange. If a servant, clearly ragged and clearly unreliable, is still spoken to as someone who might one day become independent. A black labourer, well dressed by local standards and known to be competent, is addressed with suspicion first and recognition second. The contrast is quiet but relentless. One man is imagined inside the future. The other is treated as if the future has already been sealed around him. Historians still debate exactly how colonists in the 17th century understood race as a developed ideology versus a set of hardening practices that later gained fuller intellectual explanation. Some scholars argue that economic demand and legal convenience came first, with racial thinking growing more elaborate afterward. Others see racial prejudice as deeply embedded from the start, shaping labour choices and social boundaries at every stage. What seems beyond dispute is that by 1660, skin colour is becoming more than description. It is becoming policy in waiting. You enter a churchyard where the grass is uneven and the wooden structure gives off the smell of sun-warmed boards and old dust. Religious space should promise equal souls before God. Colonial reality prefers a more selective theology. People gather, and even here the body is read socially before it is considered spiritually. Where one stands, who speaks, who is corrected, who is watched, and who is assumed to require discipline. All these decisions carry the colony's growing attachment to colour-coded rank. Some ministers struggle with the implications. If a black person is baptised, what then should Christian membership complicate bondage? Does the soul disturb the ledger? Certain colonists seem briefly troubled by these questions, which is at least evidence that conscience was not completely absent. Then many of them solve the problem in the least admirable way possible. They separate spiritual equality from earthly status so neatly that religion can bless hierarchy without interrupting it. It is a very efficient trick, morally dreadful, but efficient. The touch of this sorting reaches daily movement too. You feel it at thresholds, who may enter through the front, who waits outside, who removes a hat, who is made to stand aside, in a narrow lane between houses. A white child barrels past an older black woman without apology because the colony is already teaching him something about rank before he can spell his own name. Children absorb power the way linen absorbs smoke, quickly and thoroughly. There is also the matter of speech. Names are shortened, distorted, replaced, or spoken with a tone that strips dignity from them. Forms of address signal the entire social weather of a place. A white man may be called Mr., while a black elder is addressed like a tool that has somehow learned to walk. Language does not only reflect status, it manufactures it hour by hour. One curious feature of colonial life is how much people claim to be judging character while relying on appearance. English settlers loved to lecture about industry, morality, obedience, and godliness. They were forever classifying souls with the confidence of men who had spent one afternoon near a Bible and never quite recovered. Yet as blackness became more tightly linked to servitude, the colony judged less by conduct and more by inherited assumption. Character talk remained. The conclusion often arrived in advance. You see this plainly at a public dispute near a storehouse. Two labourers are accused of some minor disorder, perhaps rough language or delay in carrying out a task. The white man is scolded as troublesome. The black man is treated as threatening. Same incident, different imagination. One is an irritation, the other is a category. That difference matters because punishment follows imagination long before it follows evidence. Touch becomes political too. The same hand that clasps one shoulder in a rough friendship may strike another in command. The colony teaches bodies how they may be handled. A free black person might still move within local society, own property, or negotiate certain rights. But colour increasingly draws a ring of suspicion around those achievements. Success does not erase the mark imposed by others. It merely makes the colony invent new reasons to resent or limit it. You pass a house where linen hangs to dry, stiff in the light breeze, and a black woman works beside a brewing barrel, while an English mistress gives instructions from the shade. The smells are yeast, ash, sour washwater, and rosemary. The work is skilled. The supervision is social theatre as much as practical necessity. Authority likes to be seen. The point is not only that one person directs another, the point is that everyone nearby witnesses who is expected to obey. Even leisure, such as it exists, is sorted. A white labourer off task may be called lazy or drunk. A black labourer lingering too long risks being read as insolent, idle, or suspicious. One body is allowed flaws because it still belongs inside the human range imagined by the colony. The other body is treated as permanently in need of control. That distinction becomes the seed of a wider racial order. The law and custom feed each other. A court ruling lowers expectations in one place. A household practice enforces it in another. A minister's sermon justifies restraint. A planter's profit rewards it. Soon skin colour carries consequences whether or not the latest statute mentions every detail. The colony is making race into a social fact by living it before fully codifying it. A black child running through a yard learns this with painful speed, which adults smile, which adults narrow their eyes, which doors welcome, which doors do not, which mistakes are corrected gently, which mistakes become proof of some larger judgment. Childhood here involves rapid training in other people's assumptions. It is not fair, and it is not subtle. At the same time, not everything is total. That is part of what makes this moment so tense. There are black people in the colonies who are free, who own land, who marry, who work for themselves, who appear in records as active participants in local life. Their presence unsettles the neatest racial theories because it reveals the system still under construction. But the response of colonial society is not to embrace complexity. It is to narrow it. Freedom that contradicts the desired social order begins to look, to the powerful, like a problem to be solved. You hear that problem discussed in half-finished remarks. A planter complains that distinctions must be kept clear. A neighbour says servants must know their place. A local official worries aloud about disorder. Their words are rarely philosophical. They are practical in the most dangerous sense. They want a colony where labour can be predicted, inheritance controlled, and hierarchy seen at a glance. Skin offers them a brutal convenience. By afternoon the heat shimmers above the path, and the smell of tar, horse sweat, and drying leaf hangs over the settlement. A black craftsman examines a tool handle with expert fingers, while a white man who knows less instructs him anyway. It would be funny if it were not so constant. Competence and status continue their awkward separation. The colony values skill while denying full respect to those who provide it. You begin to understand that racism is not only hatred, it is also the disciplined habit of taking without honouring, using without trusting, and commanding without really seeing, in homes, on roads, at church, at market, near the docks, and in the fields. The weight of skin settles a little more each day. It tells some people that no amount of labour will make them fully safe. It tells others that even poverty does not cancel the advantages of whiteness. A poor English servant may live hard, be whipped, cheated, or discarded, yet he can still look downward in the social order and be told there is someone below him by nature. That message is politically useful. It helps divide the labouring population and persuades the miserable to guard the system that exploits them. As evening nears, the light softens and the settlement smells of supper fires, boiled grain, and damp grass. Shadows stretch across the lane. A group of men talk outside a storehouse, and though their words drift apart in the breeze, the pattern remains easy to read. They are discussing labour, control, and reliability. They're talking about people as if people were weather or livestock. One points with his chin toward a passing black worker, and the gesture carries the full burden of the age. He does not need to explain himself. Others understand. That, perhaps, is the clearest sign of all. Meaning no longer has to be argued each time. Colour itself is beginning to do the work. The colony has not finished building its racial order, but it is teaching everyone the outline. A face, a hand, a child, a mother, a labourer, a worshipper, a witness. Each is seen through a filter growing harder by the year. The evening breeze brushes your skin with a little coolness at last. Smoke drifts upward into the dimming sky. Somewhere nearby, a door closes. Somewhere else, another remains closed before anyone even reaches it. Home, in the colony, is a dangerous word. It suggests safety, routine, a place where the body can unclench and the mind can stop listening for trouble. Yet for many black people in 1660, home exists under strain so constant that even tenderness has to move carefully. A cabin, a cooking fire, a sleeping mat, a child leaning into your side. These can all feel precious. They can also feel fragile enough to break under a stranger's decision. You step into the domestic spaces of the settlement at dusk, when labour in the fields has loosened but not truly ended. Smoke hangs low above the roofs. The air smells of ash, boiling cornmeal, damp wood, and the sour sweetness of spilled cider near a doorway. Babies cry, dogs bark, chickens settle noisily, and someone nearby knocks dirt from a hoe against a fence post with the steady irritation of a person who has had enough of the day. Evening should belong to rest. In colonial life, it belongs to second shifts. Inside a small dwelling, the ceiling feels low and the heat lingers in the boards. The floor is packed earth, cool in places, gritty in others. Straw rustles underfoot. A pot simmers over the fire, sending out a plain but comforting smell of grain and greens. The light is soft and uneven, turning faces into warm shadows. This is where family life tries to gather itself. Not in grand rooms, in cramped ones, in spaces where every object matters because there are so few of them. A woman stirs the pot with one hand while steadying a child with the other. Her sleeves are damp from the day's work and from washing. Her shoulders carry fatigue so familiar it has become part of her posture. Nearby, an older child threads something through cloth with careful fingers. Learning repair before ease. A man sits on a rough stool rubbing a sore wrist, his palm lined with dirt that no quick wash will remove. Nobody looks theatrical. That is what makes the scene so powerful. Survival here is ordinary and repeated and stubborn. For black families and kin networks in the colonies, the household is often less stable than the word family deserves. Some households include people bound in service under one roof but with different legal statuses. Some couples are recognised informally rather than securely in law. Some children belong to mothers who know that outside authority may claim the right to decide their future. Some family ties must be built across distance, plantation boundaries, or the memory of ocean crossings that broke older worlds apart. Affection exists. So does interruption. You notice how much care is embedded in small acts. A portion of food set aside for the youngest child. A shirt patched where the fabric would otherwise rub raw skin. Hair braided slowly near the firelight. A lullaby hummed low enough to avoid attention, but steady enough to calm a frightened baby. These gestures do not look dramatic beside the colony's courts and fields, yet they are essential. They say, you're still a person here. You're still held by someone. In a system bent on extraction, care itself becomes a quiet defence. Historians still debate the degree to which early black family formation in English North America can be traced in official records, because the records are patchy, biased, and often uninterested in intimate life unless property or punishment is involved. Some scholars emphasise the fragility of family under early colonial bondage. Others point to strong evidence of kin-making, partnership, godparent-like roles, and community ties that persisted despite disruption. Both truths can live together. Families were vulnerable, and families were resourceful. The colony's domestic spaces are shaped by gender as much as by race and status. Black women often bear crushing layers of labour. They work in fields, kitchens, wash areas, dairy spaces, gardens, and sick rooms. They prepare food, carry water, patch clothing, 10 children, and absorb the emotional strain of holding a household together when outside power is always close. The work is physical, but it is also strategic. You must know what can be spared, what must be hidden, whom to trust with news, how to soothe fear without promising too much. There is no official title for such expertise. The colony simply consumes it. A child reaches toward the fire and is gently pulled back. The motion is quick, practiced, affectionate. Then the adult's face tightens for a second, perhaps from worry, perhaps from a thought that passes like a draft through the room. Safety is never only about flames or sharp tools here. It is about the wider fact that children are growing inside a system that may lay claim to their labour, movement, and status long before they understand any of those words. One especially bitter truth of colonial domestic life is that the home can be both refuge and site of surveillance. In smaller holdings, masters and mistresses may live close to the people they command. Walls are thin, yards are shared, instructions enter at all hours. A person's private grief has to coexist with public obedience. There may be little physical distance between the authority that exploits you and the place where you try to comfort your child to sleep. Intimacy, in such settings, becomes structured by unequal power, which makes every domestic scene more tense than it first appears. You step back outside and cross a yard where laundry hangs stiff from a line. The cloth smells of lye and river water. A woman empties wash into the dirt, and steam rises faintly in the cooling air. Nearby, a young boy is sent to fetch kindling and returns dragging branches larger than seems reasonable, which he does with the solemn determination of a very small labourer already auditioning for adult exhaustion. Children in this world learn usefulness early. They also learn fear early. There are moments of joy, though they come with caution. A baby laughs. Someone tells a dry joke while scraping a cooking pot. Two girls make a game from pebbles and little sung rules only they fully understand. A man whittles a small toy from leftover wood with more care than the toy's size would suggest. These scenes matter because they show that black domestic life is not reducible to suffering, even under severe conditions. People still tease, sing, flirt, dream, and protect one another. The system seeks control. It does not erase the human urge to love. One quirky detail of 17th century household life is how much work clustered around the fire, which was at once stove, heater, light source, and social centre. A good fire meant cooked food, dried clothing, warmth, and some defence against damp misery. A bad fire meant smoke in the eyes, scorched pots, wasted fuel, and everybody's mood sinking at once. Domestic skill around the hearth could shape the tone of an entire evening. In a strange way, the fire was both servant and tyrant, always needing attention, much like several of the colony's men. The smells of the home are strong and layered. Smoke in the rafters, fat warming in a pot, wet wool drying too slowly, greens wilting into supper, straw, skin, clay, ash. The texture of colonial life is intensely material, and that materiality is different depending on status. A wealthy English planter's home may have imported goods, heavier furniture, perhaps pewter, better bedding, and more space. A black family or household unit under labour pressure works with scarcity, improvisation, and items worn nearly to disappearance. Every possession carries a story of effort. You see a mother braiding a child's hair by the door while the last light fades. Her fingers move carefully, separating, smoothing, tightening, finishing. Hair care is practical, cultural, and intimate all at once. It takes time, and time in the colony is never neutral. To spend time on grooming, on neatness, on preserving a sense of self, is to refuse complete collapse into mere labour. You begin to understand why authorities so often dislike unmonitored domestic time. It allows people to remain more than useful. There is also mourning inside these homes, though it may not always speak its name aloud. a missing relative, a child lost to illness, a husband sold or transferred, a wife seen only at intervals because labour arrangements divide where people sleep or work. The colony breaks continuity and then expects people to continue cooking, mending, and rising before dawn as though nothing has happened. Grief becomes another household task, folded between the visible ones. In some places, black domestic life draws strength from shared living arrangements or neighbouring support. An older woman may help a new mother's. A man skilled with herbs or splinting may be called when a child falls sick. News travels between cabins, kitchens, and work areas through people who know how to carry it lightly. The household, then, is not only one structure, it can be a network of care stretched across several. This matters deeply in a society where official protection is unreliable or absent. The touch of fear remains everywhere. Footsteps at night can change the air in a room. A knock can mean an order, an inspection, a summons, a warning, or trouble with no proper name. A woman pauses in her stirring when voices rise outside. A man listening near the doorway keeps his face still. A child senses tension before understanding it and goes quiet. Fear is a household resident in 1660. It does not pay rent. It never leaves. Yet tenderness persists. A hand laid on a tired shoulder, a cloth soaked and pressed to a fevered forehead. A story told softly to distract from hunger. Some stories may hold fragments of Africa, others English bits learned in the colony, others something newly made in the meeting of broken worlds. Memory survives by changing shape. That, too, is part of domestic life. As night settles, the home becomes softer in sound, if not in certainty. Firewood shifts with little sighing pops. Crickets begin outside. A baby suckles sleepily. Someone folds linen. Someone rubs aching feet. Someone stares into the embers a little too long. Thinking thoughts best kept behind the eyes. The body wants rest, but the mind keeps counting what could be lost. A child, a partner, a hard-won routine, a small patch of safety. In the colony, the household is where power becomes painfully personal. Laws written by men who never fetch water themselves can reach directly into a mother's future. Economic choices made in distant markets can decide whether a husband is kept, hired out, or sold. A mistress's mood can shape the entire evening. A master's debt can alter where children wake next season. The private sphere is never fully private because labour and ownership keep forcing their way through the door. And still, within those cramped walls and smoky yards, people make life, not just endurance. Life. They cook enough to share a little. They save cloth scraps. They laugh when they can. They comfort the frightened. They mark growth in children even when the colony marks those children for something colder. Home may be insecure, but the effort to create it is real. The night air outside carries the smell of banked fires and damp grass. The stars sharpen above the black shape of the trees. One by one, voices lower, doors close, babies sleep. Adults remain half awake in the way only tired people under pressure can, resting and listening at the same time. In that uneasy quiet, you feel the weight of what these homes hold: hunger, memory, strain, skill, affection, and fear all crowded together. The colony would like to make people into labour alone, but here, in the dark glow of the hearth, they keep becoming family anyway. By now, you can tell when punishment is coming by the way the air changes around a yard. Conversation thins, eyes avoid one another or fix too carefully on the ground. Someone who had been moving briskly suddenly moves with elaborate calm, as if neat motions might keep trouble from settling on the wrong shoulders. In the colony, discipline is not simply about correcting a single act. It is meant to be seen, remembered, and feared. Authorities want pain to travel farther than the body receiving it. The morning begins hot again, because colonial weather has very limited imagination. The sky is pale and bright, and the earth still smells of wet clay from a shower during the night. A rooster calls, dogs answer, and somewhere a child cries with the offended outrage available only to children and small kings. Yet beneath these ordinary sounds runs another current. News has passed through the settlement that someone has disobeyed, run, stolen, answered back, or simply been accused of doing so. The exact offence may change from telling to telling. The ritual does not. You walk toward an open space near a storehouse and a post set firmly into the ground. It is a plain place, which somehow makes it worse. No grand architecture softens the meaning. A post, a rope, a handful of officials or household authorities, and a gathering crowd. Colonial power likes these simple arrangements. They are cheap, visible, and hard to misunderstand. The smells here are vivid and unpleasant in combination. Tar from a repaired barrel, horse sweat, stale tobacco, sun-warmed wood, damp wool on men who started the day in the cool and now regret their layering choices. Dust rises under boots and hangs briefly in the light. A fly lands on the post, lifts again, and lands once more with the confidence of a creature that has never attended a moral lecture. Punishment in the 17th century can take many forms. Whipping is among the most common and most public. Service can be extended, food may be withheld, movement restricted, bodies bound, names called out, shame applied as deliberately as force. Officials and masters are not only trying to stop one person from repeating an act, they are teaching everyone nearby what sort of power rules the colony. A warning, once embodied, becomes easier to administer again. Black people face especially harsh treatment in this environment, because the colony is moving toward a system where labour control must be absolute, visible, and racialized. A white servant might also be whipped, fined, or extended in service. Colonial authorities were perfectly capable of cruelty across the board, but for black labourers, punishment increasingly carries the extra meaning of permanent subordination. The body is not merely corrected, it is marked as belonging under command. Historians still argue over how much local variation existed in the severity and frequency of punishment before later slave codes made the system more explicit. Some evidence suggests smaller households could be inconsistent, with daily supervision taking different forms from one place to another. Other evidence shows that even before comprehensive legal codification, violence and spectacle already played a central role in enforcing labour discipline. That uncertainty in scale should not soften the truth. People in power understood fear very well. A crowd gathers with the false casualness of people pretending they have simply happened to be nearby. Some are white servants relieved not to be the focus today. Some are planters or overseers whose faces carry that unpleasant mixture of boredom and righteousness. Some are black workers forced to stand and witness, knowing that looking too long is dangerous and looking away may also be judged. Public punishment traps everyone inside its lesson. The person at the centre may have run for a day, or spoken sharply, or resisted an order, or been blamed for damage that happened because tools were poor and tempers poorer. Colonial discipline is not famous for its careful fairness. Accusation often arrives already dressed as proof. Once authority decides an example is needed, the details become surprisingly flexible. One of the grimmest features of this world is that humiliation is useful to power precisely because it is social. Pain hurts, shame lingers. To be corrected before others, to have your body turned into a message, is to be placed inside a story written by someone else. Authorities know this. They build punishment as theatre. Not sophisticated theatre, certainly. More village scolding with ropes. But theatre all the same. You hear the scrape of boots, the crack of a branch under someone shifting position. The murmur of voices quickly suppressed. A man in authority speaks with a tone meant to sound measured, as though cruelty becomes respectable when delivered slowly. He talks of order, obedience, and example. The words are familiar. Colonial rulers adore the word order because it makes their fear sound noble. The punishment begins, and the crowd absorbs it in silence. Silence can mean many things here: agreement, horror, self-protection, numbness, calculation. A child nearby is pulled back by the shoulder and told not to stare, which naturally guarantees staring. The lesson enters young minds early. The colony trains its future adults by exposing them to authority in visible form. That is how a harsh system teaches itself to survive. You notice how bodies in the crowd react. A white servant flinches despite himself. A black woman keeps her face turned slightly aside while holding every muscle still. An older man narrows his eyes not from cruelty, but from that complicated expression people wear when they're forcing themselves to remember everything. Witnessing can itself become a form of memory work. The authorities want spectators to remember fear. Spectators may also remember injustice. One odd detail of colonial disciplinary life is how often fines and penalties could be calculated in tobacco. Even punishment had to smell like the cash crop. A person might owe labour, leaf, or both, because the colony was determined to make every moral failing somehow convertible into agricultural accounting. It is hard to overstate how much 17th century Chesapeake society managed to make tobacco everyone's problem. The public nature of discipline also affects white workers. Poor Europeans live under a regime of control that is brutal in its own right. They can be whipped, extended, confined, and degraded. Yet that shared suffering does not produce lasting solidarity often enough to threaten the system. Instead, authorities encourage difference. Whiteness offers a rung, however shabby, above blackness. That distinction becomes one of the colony's most useful political inventions. A miserable man may still defend a structure that humiliates him if he believes it humiliates someone else more completely. Punishment is not only physical. Surveillance itself becomes a warning. You feel it in the way people are counted, watched, and questioned about where they have been. A pass not granted, a road not permitted, a tool checked, a conversation interrupted. The colony would like every black person's movement to become legible to authority. That desire is still forming in 1660, but it is unmistakable. Control of motion is control of possibility. Near a workyard, a young black man is searched after being accused of keeping something aside. The item is trivial, perhaps food, perhaps a small tool, perhaps nothing at all that justifies the scene. The important part is the inspection itself. Hands pat at clothing, eyes scan pockets and bundles. The message is clear. Your person is not private. Your body can be examined whenever suspicion finds you convenient. Domestic punishments carry their own terrors. A woman may be threatened with sale or separation from children. A man may be denied visits to family, hired out, or singled out for harsher labour. Children may be frightened into obedience through example, long before they fully understand legal status. These methods do not always leave obvious marks. They leave deeper ones. In households, mistresses as well as masters can play active roles in discipline. Colonial women with authority over domestic labour often enforce routines, report perceived insolence, and demand punishment. This does not erase their own constraints within patriarchal society. It simply reminds you that power, once offered a smaller room, still has furniture to throw around. The kitchen, yard, and wash space can become arenas of command as sharp as any field. You cross past a whipping post later in the day when it stands empty again. It looks unimpressive, almost foolish, just wood in the sun. That is another cruelty of systems like this. Their instruments can appear plain once the crowd has dispersed. The screams, the silence, the warning, the humiliation, all of it vanishes into memory while the object remains ordinary. A fence post, a beam, a rope coiled aside. The landscape keeps its evidence with a straight face. There are also acts of refusal, though they rarely look heroic in the storybook sense. Someone slows the pace of work after a punishment, not enough to be charged, but enough to keep a little inner verdict alive. Someone shares food with the punished person that evening. Someone passes along information about which overseer is angriest today. Someone tends wounds in secret. These gestures matter. They do not overturn the system, but they interrupt its claim to total control. By afternoon, the settlement resumes its routines with disturbing efficiency. Pots simmer, leaves are sorted, water is hauled, a cart axle squeals. Children chase each other until shouted back into usefulness. Colonial society depends on this return to normal. Spectacle would lose its force if daily life stopped each time cruelty appeared. Instead, punishment is folded into routine until routine itself becomes complicit. You hear talk among authorities about the need for stronger discipline, clearer categories, fewer ambiguities. They worry about servants running together, about mixed labouring populations, about insolence, theft, and disobedience. Beneath these worries lies a harder truth. They're trying to build a system in which black labour can be extracted with maximum predictability. Fear is one of the tools that makes the machine run. At sunset, the sky turns copper near the river, and the breeze carries a little coolness through the yard. Smoke from cooking fire softens the smell of dust and sweat. The crowd has long since scattered, but the lesson remains in the air. A child asks a question and is hushed. A woman rinses cloth at a tub with hands that do not pause. A man sits with his elbows on his knees, looking at nothing visible. Punishment is over. Its work continues. You begin to understand that public warnings do more than enforce obedience in the moment. They teach people how much of themselves to hide, how far not to go, when not to speak, whom not to trust, and what price the colony is willing to exact for the smallest refusal. Fear settles into muscle memory. It changes posture, pace, tone, and sleep. Night gathers slowly. Crickets begin their steady song. Somewhere out by the marsh, frogs answer. The post in the yard becomes a dark shape against darker ground. It stands there without shame, because wood has none. The colony supplies the rest. In the quiet, people carry home the sight of what they have been made to witness. Authorities hope that memory will produce submission. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it produces something harder to measure. A slow inward refusal to let cruelty decide what is true. But either way, the lesson has been delivered in the language this society trusts most force-made public. Night is often the only time the colony loosens its grip, and even then it does so reluctantly. The fields go dim, the tools are set down, the loud voices of command fade into private rooms, muttering embers, and the smug breathing of people who believe the day's order will simply hold until morning. But once darkness spreads over the yards, cabins, paths, and riverbanks, another kind of life becomes easier to hear. Softer, certainly. Safer, perhaps not. Yet more truly human. You step into that nighttime world when the air feels thick and warm against your face, and the smell of banked fires drifts low over the ground. Crickets sing from the grass. Frogs call from the marshes with a wet, insistent rhythm. Somewhere a child whimpers in sleep, then settles again. A wooden ladle knocks gently against a pot. Footsteps move lightly, carefully, because some conversations are meant for listening ears and others are not. This is where faith lives differently from how it appears in church. Not always in formal sermons or polished prayers, but in fragments carried quietly from one person to another. A whispered blessing over a baby, a murmur before sleep, a remembered phrase from Africa mixed with a Christian line learned in the colony. A hand laid gently on a shoulder while someone sick breathes too fast in the dark. Belief here is practical. It comforts, explains, warns, and binds people together when the world outside offers little kindness. Many black people in the 17th century encounter Christianity through English households. Ministers and planters who imagine themselves spiritual guides while remaining deeply committed to hierarchy. The contradiction is glaring, though the colony wears it like a favourite coat. Some enslaved and unfree people absorb parts of Christian teaching, especially stories of suffering, deliverance, judgment, and endurance. Others preserve older spiritual understandings from West and Central Africa, sometimes openly in memory, more often by adaptation. In practice, these are not always separate streams. They blend, overlap, and shift according to need. Historians still debate how much continuity African spiritual traditions retained in the earliest English colonies, because direct documentation is sparse and usually filtered through outsiders who misunderstood what they saw. Some scholars emphasize retention through ritual forms, healing knowledge, music, naming, and cosmological habits. Others stress the enormous disruption of the Atlantic trade and the pressures of colonial life. Both views reveal something important. Even when institutions are broken, people do not simply arrive empty. You notice this in the way some evenings unfold. A small group gathers near a fire, not in obvious defiance, but with enough closeness to make something communal. The smoke smells sweet where pine catches and bitter where damp wood sulks. Faces glow and disappear in turns. One person begins a low song, more pulse than performance. Another joins softly. The melody may not sound grand to an outsider, but it holds memory in it. Rhythm can carry what written records never will. A woman unwraps a small cloth bundle containing herbs gathered earlier. The leaves smell sharp, earthy, and medicinal. She crushes some between her fingers and adds them to warm water for a child with a cough. Healing in the colony is rarely neat or licensed. It is a patchwork of African knowledge, indigenous remedies, English household practices, and plain hard experience. The people with the least official authority often know the most about keeping a body going through fever, childbirth, injury, or exhaustion. This fact is not lost on the colony, though it is rarely honoured properly. One curious detail of early colonial life is how often people turn to folk remedies, while loudly praising formal religion. A man might quote scripture in the morning and quietly ask for a charm, root, or protective preparation by evening if his household fell ill. Human consistency, it seems, has never been the empire's strong point. Need makes pragmatists of nearly everyone. You walk past a doorway where an older woman is speaking in a low, measured cadence to two younger listeners. She's not merely telling them what plant helps a stomach pain or how to cool a fever cloth. She's also teaching them how to notice, which seasons bring certain illnesses, which damp corners of a dwelling make coughs worse, which people can be trusted with news, which silences are protective, and which are dangerous. This is knowledge the colony does not formally record, yet it is essential to survival. Resistance in this world often hides inside such ordinary acts. Saving food, slowing a task without attracting punishment, passing information quietly, keeping a name alive, preserving a practice of care, pretending not to know more than you know. Colonial authorities fear rebellion in the dramatic sense, but daily life is shaped just as much by smaller refusals. The refusal to let someone else's category become your whole self, the refusal to surrender every custom, the refusal to become spiritually empty. At the riverbank, a few figures stand where the reeds whisper against the tide. The water smells cool, muddy, and metallic in the night air. Moonlight touches the surface in broken pieces. Someone washes a cloth, someone fills a bucket, someone simply stands breathing. The river offers practical things, but it also offers a momentary feeling of space, under the sky, away from the direct line of a master's doorway. Thought can stretch a little. You hear stories exchanged there, not official history, the other kind, a tale about a place across the ocean where the rains sounded different, a memory of a mother grinding grain in a courtyard long gone, a warning about a man in the settlement who listens too eagerly, a murmur about an English sermon and the sly amusement it produced. Gentle sarcasm survives here as a quiet survival skill. When power is pompous, humour keeps the soul from kneeling too low. Children absorb this world carefully. They watch elders make signs, whisper prayers, share remedies, and maintain customs that the colony barely sees. They learn when to ask and when not to ask. They learn that not every truth belongs in daylight. A child may notice that adults lower their voices around certain names or use two explanations for the same event, one for authority and one for their own people. This double knowledge becomes part of growing up under domination. Music matters especially because it can travel where speech is dangerous. A hummed tune while stirring a pot, a work rhythm tapped lightly on wood, a cradle song whose words sound simple but hold layered meaning. Sound shapes memory. Sound gathers people. Sound can also mislead eavesdroppers, which is useful in any century but particularly useful in a colony full of suspicious men with weak imaginations. Some customs remain visible in touch and dress, a pattern of braiding, a preferred seasoning, the way a sleeping child is wrapped, the way mourning is expressed through silence, cloth, or gesture. These are not trivial details. They are the texture of continuity. The colony may control labour, but it cannot completely dictate how a person stirs a pot, arranges hair, tends a wound, or remembers the dead. You come to a cabin where someone has scratched marks into wood near a sleeping space. Counting, perhaps, or remembrance, or both. Such marks appear humble, even accidental, yet they can hold worlds. People under pressure often create records outside official paper because official paper belongs to somebody else. A mark on timber, a hidden object, a repeated phrase, a songline, all can serve as anchors for identity. There are also open acts of resistance, though they are dangerous and not always successful. Running away, breaking tools, feigning illness, sabotaging pace, refusing an instruction at the wrong moment because dignity finally outweighs caution. The colony responds harshly because it understands what even small defiance reveals. Its authority is not natural. It must be enforced again and again. Every act of resistance, however limited, exposes that truth. A man with sore hands and tired eyes tells another that he dropped a tool by accident that morning. Only his tone suggests the accident was guided by a private sense of justice. They do not laugh loudly. Loud laughter travels, but their silence warms a little. Shared knowledge, even tiny knowledge, can steady people. Religion, too, can become quietly resistant. Biblical stories of captivity and deliverance take on new force in unfree communities, even when ministers intend safer lessons about obedience. Prayer can become a place where the powerful do not fully control meaning. A person hearing about Israel in bondage may draw conclusions the planter would rather not sponsor. Faith is slippery that way. Once a story enters the world, it does not always stay loyal to the man who preached it. You pass a sick bed where an elder breathes with effort while another person wipes the forehead with water scented faintly by crushed leaves. The room smells of sweat, smoke, damp cloth, and herbs. Care is given with patience rather than panic. There is no illusion that the colony will rescue the vulnerable. People rescue one another where they can. That is its own form of resistance, too. To preserve life in a system that wastes it is an act of refusal. Outside, the stars brighten over the dark line of trees. Firelight flickers in small openings across the settlement, each glow holding its own worries, prayers, and plans. A woman steps into the yard and looks upward for a moment, just breathing the cooler air. Then she returns inside, carrying water with a steadiness that suggests long practice in continuing. What you begin to understand is that resistance does not always announce itself. It may look like memory, it may smell like rosemary and sage, it may sound like a low melody no overseer bothers to interpret. It may feel like a hand squeezing another hand in the dark after a terrible day. The colony wants obedience that reaches into body and spirit alike. But spirit is troublesome. It slips around orders. It hides in ritual, humour, affection, and hope. By late night, voices fade, embers settle into red islands under ash. Insects keep up their patient music. Somewhere, very softly, someone speaks a prayer over sleeping children. The words are too low to catch from where you stand, yet the intention fills the room all the same. Protection, endurance. Tomorrow, somehow. The night receives it without comment. This quiet world does not overturn the colony by morning. It does something subtler and just as important. It keeps people from becoming only what power has named them. In herbs, songs, blessings, whispered warnings, remembered gestures, and small acts of refusal. Black life in 1660 preserves a dignity the surrounding society is working hard to erase. The marsh breathes in the dark. The river keeps moving. Smoke drifts upward and disappears among the stars. Still, beneath that wide night sky, human beings hold on to themselves with remarkable care. The lawmakers do not look especially dramatic. That is part of the problem. They are men in coats that smell faintly of horse, wool, and pipe smoke, sitting in rooms where the air turns stale long before their ideas do. They speak in measured phrases about order, inheritance, labour, property, religion, and the peace of the colony. Nothing in their tone announces that they are helping build a future of generational bondage. Yet that is exactly what they are doing. You arrive on a day when officials and local elites are discussing rules with that slow, satisfied seriousness. Powerful men often adopt when they believe they are being practical. Papers are unfolded. Ink is refreshed. Benches creak. Outside, the settlement moves through its ordinary sounds of cartwheels, livestock, distant hammering, and people fetching water. Inside, the work is quieter, more lasting grows. Too, a field can be replanted, a roof can be mended, a law can reach into children not yet born. The room smells of ink, damp wood, old wax, and the faint peppery scent of wet wool drying on shoulders. A clerk sits ready to flatten human life into neat lines. One man clears his throat often, as if preparing his voice might improve the morality of what he's about to support. Another taps his fingers on the table with the impatience of someone who wants complexity to hurry up and disappear. This is how legal cruelty often sounds at the start. Tidy, administrative, mildly annoyed. In the Chesapeake colonies, the pressure to define black status more clearly grows out of several anxieties at once. Planters want predictable labour. Officials want social control. Households want fewer disputes over service terms, parentage, inheritance, baptism, and mixed ancestry. In plain language, powerful people want a colony where they can tell at a glance who may be used, for how long, and whether that condition can pass to the next generation. Ambiguity once allowed a few openings. Law now moves to close them. You can hear the logic forming even when it's not spoken plainly. If black labour is profitable, it must be secured. If children can be claimed through the condition of the mother, then future labour can be secured too. If Christianity does not alter bondage, then religion can stop interfering with profit. If interracial unions are treated with alarm, then social boundaries can be protected before they become too blurred for comfort. Every concern is framed as order. Every solution points toward a permanence. Historians still debate the precise pace at which different statutes and local customs lock together into a full hereditary slave system in English North America. Some laws arrive earlier in one colony, some later in another, and practice can outrun statute for years. Yet by the middle and later 17th century, especially in Virginia and Maryland, the direction is unmistakable. Legislators increasingly define blackness as inheritable unfreedom. The future is being fenced in before it arrives. One of the most devastating legal developments is the rule that a child's status follows that of the mother. To lawmakers, this may sound neat, useful, and administratively clever. To women living under bondage, it is terrifying. It means your womb can be turned into the colony's labour strategy. Your children are no longer simply children in the eyes of power. They become future assets, future workers, future property in waiting. A sentence drafted by men with clean cuffs can settle like a curse over generations. The horror of such law is not only that it enslaves, it also rearranges intimacy. Pregnancy now carries a sharper political meaning. Sexual coercion, already a brutal reality, becomes even more profitable within a hereditary framework. The colony can deny women control over their own bodies, and then profit again through the status of their children. That is not a side effect. It is part of the structure. You step outside for air and find two women speaking softly near a wall warmed by afternoon sun. One balances a child on her hip, the other keeps glancing toward the meeting place. Neither needs to hear each phrase inside to understand the danger. News travels. Rules discussed among officials become household facts with frightening speed. A woman's face tightens slightly as the child reaches for a loose thread in her sleeve. Even in this ordinary gesture, the future feels close enough to touch. The lawmakers also worry about religion, though only up to the point where religion threatens ownership. If baptism once raised awkward questions about whether a Christian could be held in bondage, legislators seek to settle that awkwardness firmly. Conversion must not free anyone. The soul may be welcomed in theory, provided the body remains billable. It is one of the colony's more impressive moral evasions, and that is saying something in a century not exactly short on evasions. A few men mention disorder, as they always do when they want power to sound responsible. They fear mixed households, uncertain parentage, claims on property, servants who compare their conditions, and communities where black freedom remains visible enough to unsettle the desired hierarchy. When elites speak anxiously about disorder, they usually mean people refusing to stay in the boxes most useful to wealth. Simplicity for them means confinement for others. One curious thing about colonial lawmakers is how often they speak as though they are reluctantly tidying up chaos that arrived by itself, when in fact they are actively designing the chaos into a new pattern. It is the legal version of a man setting a fire and then complimenting himself for organising the buckets. They do not simply observe racial slavery, they shape its inheritance, vocabulary, and domestic reach. You hear discussion of mixed ancestry and the colony's discomfort sharpens. Children who cross the line officials want to harden force the legal system into awkward honesty. If race is to function as social architecture, then blurry categories are a problem. Law responds by sharpening penalties, clarifying dissent, and policing relationships. Not because people suddenly discovered difference, but because difference was being organised into a durable hierarchy that needed better maintenance. Inheritance law becomes another tool in this transformation. Land, livestock, tools, tobacco, and human beings all appear in overlapping legal worlds of property and succession. Estate inventories can sit human lives disturbingly near household goods and farm equipment. Such documents reveal the practical mind of the system. Sentiment is not the point. Transfer is. Ownership must continue cleanly. The dead leave instructions, the living carry them out. A child may lose a parent and still watch the machinery of property move on without pause. You visit a household where an English planter's widow consults with a male advisor about debts, land, and labour. Papers cover the table. Beeswax and stale ale scent the room. Outside, someone is chopping wood with regular punishing force. Inside, the conversation turns casually to who remains attached to the estate and under what terms. The matter is discussed with the same tone used for fencing repairs. This is the true achievement of the developing legal order. It teaches people to discuss black futures without recognising them as futures. Some free black families feel the tightening climate even if they are not immediately reduced. A land holding, a contract, a known status. None of these feels fully secure when lawmakers are busy redefining the world around you. Visibility can become dangerous. To be known as free while the law narrows the category is to feel the ground shift under your own feet. A man may still hold property and yet understand that the next generation will face a harsher court, a harsher neighbour, and a harsher presumption. The colony also tries to prevent alliances that might threaten its labour order. Poor whites, black labourers, and other marginal people share enough suffering to worry the elite. So the law and its surrounding customs offer white workers small privileges and social reassurance, encouraging them to identify upward rather than sideways. This is not kindness, it is political engineering. A poor man is less likely to join with those beneath him if he is constantly told he is above them by nature. Dividing the exploited is one of history's more durable management strategies. By late afternoon, the discussion inside grows more specific, more technical, and somehow more chilling. Technical language can do terrible work because it sounds unexciting. A phrase about descent, a line about service, a clause about baptism, a penalty tied to a relationship. Each item seems narrow when heard alone. Together they form a trap that reaches from cradle to grave. You pass the churchyard again and notice how legal change ripples into spiritual life. A black mother attending worship may now know more sharply than before that no sacrament protects her child from the colony's appetite. A father may hear a sermon on duty while understanding that law has already judged his family differently from those sitting only a few feet away. Religion remains present, but legal reality keeps instructing people where piety ends and ownership begins. There is also a bureaucratic coldness to all this that makes it even harder to bear. No one inside the meeting place needs to shout. No one needs to display open hatred at every moment. The system can be built through notes, revisions, signatures, and quiet agreement. A man can go home afterward, eat supper, remark on the weather, and feel himself respectable. That is one reason these laws matter so much. They allow cruelty to wear routine manners. A woman carrying water along the lane pauses when two men emerge from the meeting house talking in satisfied tones. She does not hear every word, but she catches enough. Status, child, rule, order. The bucket handle bites into her hand. Water darkens the packed dirt near her feet, where a little spills. She adjusts her grip and keeps walking, because colonial life rarely permits the luxury of standing still when bad news arrives. As evening settles over the settlement, the smell of smoke and cooking grain rises again from scattered homes. The lawmakers leave their benches with the weariness of men who believe they have completed useful business. In a sense, they have useful to wealth, useful to power, useful to a colony increasingly determined to turn black life into inheritable labour. The work of theft now reaches beyond the individual. It reaches into family lines. What disappears under such laws is not only present freedom, it is tomorrow. A child who has not yet drawn a full breath can already be measured by statutes made in rooms he will never see. A girl's future work, a boy's movement, a mother's fear, a father's helpless calculation. All of it is being shaped by men discussing order over ink and benches. The violence is quieter than a whipping post. It also lasts longer. Night spreads across the fields and river. Crickets begin. Somewhere a baby is rocked to sleep while adults speak in subdued voices nearby. The stars above the colony look wide and indifferent, as stars usually do when humans are being especially inventive with injustice. Inside homes, people count what can still be protected. Outside, the new legal world keeps hardening. It does not steal only today's choices. It steals tomorrow before dawn even comes. By the end, the colony feels less like a rough experiment and more like a trap that has learned its own shape. What once looked uncertain, inconsistent, and still in motion is becoming colder, cleaner, and harder to escape. You can feel it in the roads, in the courtrooms, in the fields, in the kitchens, in the river landings, and in the ordinary tone people use when speaking about black lives as though those lives were already settled into place by nature. Nothing about it is natural. That is what makes it so chilling. Morning comes with a thin mist over the creek and the smell of wet grass, ashes and livestock rising into the pale light. A cart creaks somewhere beyond the trees. Water birds call from the marsh. A woman opens a door and shakes out a cloth. A man shoulders a tool and starts toward the fields. The colony still looks ordinary at first glance, which is one of its most dangerous talents. It knows how to hide transformation inside routine. You walk through a settlement lane where children are already learning the rules they did not write. A white child orders a black child aside with the careless confidence of someone rehearsing the future. An older woman notices and says nothing, perhaps from fear, perhaps from weariness, perhaps because the correction would cost more than the moment can bear. That small scene tells you nearly everything. Hierarchy no longer needs explanation each time. It is becoming instinctive, domestic, woven into posture and play. This is how a door closes in history. Not always with one decree or one famous event, but through the steady removal of exceptions. A few free black landholders remain. A few legal ambiguities linger. A few households still contain arrangements that do not yet fit the harsher pattern being formed. But these are narrowing spaces now. The colony is learning to distrust every crack through which autonomy might survive. Historians still debate the exact point at which the English mainland colonies fully crossed from a society with slaves into a slave society. Because the shift happened unevenly and by layers. Some emphasize law, some emphasize economic scale. Some point to changing attitudes among ordinary settlers who came to see racial slavery as the colony's normal foundation. In 1660, you stand in the middle of that hardening process. The final architecture is not complete, yet its outline is already unmistakable. Planters talk more confidently now about permanence. Officials talk more confidently about order. Ministers have found ways to speak of souls while avoiding the implications of human equality. Poor whites are increasingly encouraged to understand themselves as part of a racial ladder that grants them value above black neighbours, even when their own lives remain dirty, hungry, and precarious. The system grows stronger not because everyone prospers, but because enough people are taught where to look downward. You pass a tobacco barn where cured leaves hang in rows, dry and fragrant, their smell thick in the warm air like bitter tea and old money. Men discuss shipment, price, and labour needs. One of them glances toward a group of black workers and speaks with the casual confidence of ownership. Even if the law has not yet written every detail as neatly as he would like, practice often outruns statute. People behave their assumptions into reality, then ask lawmakers to bless what they have already begun. This new order changes the emotional climate of the colony as much as its legal structure. A black family no longer fears only a bad season, an illness, or one cruel master. The fear grows wider. It includes the sense that the whole society is aligning against your claim to a future that belongs to you. The courts, the church, the household, the market, and the field begin pointing in the same direction, that convergence matters. A single unfair man can be endured. An unfair world is something else. One curious feature of social change is how quickly people begin narrating it backward. Once a new order starts to feel stable, those who benefit from it insist it was obvious all along. They speak as though black subordination had always been the colony's natural arrangement, as though no ambiguity had ever existed. No free families had stood their ground. No alternative paths had briefly opened. Memory gets edited to flatter power. The past is made simpler, so the present can look deserved. You notice this around tables and fires. Men tell stories about labour and settlement with certain details missing. They praise industry while overlooking whose hands built the comfort they now defend. They speak of danger from outsiders while ignoring the violence in their own yards. They complain about disorder while creating a social order built on theft. The selective memory is not accidental. It is maintenance. A system this harsh requires stories to support it. At the landing, barrels are rolled toward a boat while ropes groan over wood. The river smells of mud, fish, and wet reeds under the sun. Tobacco will leave for distant markets, and silver, goods, status, and appetite will return through networks wider than any one planter's view. That is another closing of the door. The more deeply the colony joins Atlantic commerce, the more incentive it has to stabilize labour through hereditary bondage. Local cruelty links arms with global demand. The river carries both. A black man pauses briefly at the water's edge after lifting a cask. He looks out across the current as if measuring distance. Perhaps he's only catching his breath. Perhaps he's imagining another shore. The colony does not like such pauses. Any unscripted stillness can seem threatening in a world built on command. That is why authority keeps pressing for greater control over movement, gathering, inheritance, testimony, and time itself. A person who can imagine leaving is already harder to own. Women feel the closing door with particular force. Their labour remains undercounted, their vulnerability exploited, and their maternity increasingly absorbed into the colony's legal economy. To bear children under these conditions is to carry love and dread together. The cradle becomes tied to the ledger. Domestic care becomes shadowed by the knowledge that family continuity may serve not only human affection, but the ambitions of those who claim ownership. Few societies reveal their moral collapse more plainly than those that turn motherhood into inventory. You enter a yard at dusk where a woman is combing through a child's hair near the fire. The smell is smoke, tallow, and warm earth after a humid day. The child leans sleepily against her knee. Around them, evening chores continue with the usual clink of bowls and low voices. Nothing in the scene looks like legal history, yet legal history is there all the same, pressing invisibly on the mother's hands. What future can she promise? What future can anyone promise? Now that the colony is writing permanence into the body, the white poor also live inside a system that uses them, though not in the same way. They remain vulnerable to hunger, whipping, debt, and dismissal. But the colony increasingly offers them a psychological wage, the quiet assurance that whatever they're suffering, they still belong on the ruling side of the colour line. It is a powerful bargain for those at the bottom. Take a little status, surrender the chance at solidarity, guard the structure that keeps you half miserable. History has seen this trick before, and it rarely retires. Religious language continues to hover over everything like smoke that never quite clears. A minister speaks of obedience, a mistress invokes duty, a magistrate praises peace. Yet the daily evidence of the colony points elsewhere. Peace is maintained by force. Duty is demanded selectively. Obedience is holy only when required of the powerless. Black people hear these messages and understand perfectly well that words can be arranged to protect almost any injustice. They also learn to hear around them, beneath them, and against them. One small but telling sign of the closing world is the shrinking usefulness of excellence. A black man may be skilled, loyal, pious, sober, and indispensable, and still find that these virtues do not secure true standing once race hardens into inherited subordination. Under the older ambiguity, competence sometimes allowed room to negotiate. Under the new order, competence is welcome only as productivity. It need not bring recognition. The colony wants your labour, not your equality. Night comes, and with it the sounds of insects, distant frogs, and the soft crackle of cooking fires settling into embers. In some homes, people still laugh quietly. In others, they count losses. In many, they do both. Human life refuses neat categories, even in places obsessed with imposing them. Yet the broader direction is difficult to mistake now. The uncertain door that once stood half open is swinging shut. You see it in law, yes, but also in imagination. White colonists increasingly picture blackness and bondage as belonging together. That mental union may be the harshest victory of all, because once a society teaches itself to confuse domination with order, it can perpetuate cruelty with very little inner resistance. The child learns it in the yard, the official writes it at the table, the minister excuses it in the pulpit, the planter profits from it in the field. Soon the entire colony knows the script. Still, even here, complete victory never belongs to power. Black Americans in this early world continue to love, work, worship, remember, joke, heal, resist, and imagine. They preserve names, practices, skills, and affections that the colony cannot fully manage. They create families where the law threatens family. They hold faith where the church offers compromise. They keep human depth where the market sees only labour. The closing door does not erase their personhood. It reveals the brutality of those trying to deny it. The sky deepens to indigo above the tree line. Fireflies appear in the grass like brief, wandering thoughts. Smoke from the last cook fires curls upward and thins into darkness. A boat shifts against its mooring with a hollow knock, somewhere nearby. A baby finally falls asleep after a day of heat and noise. An older man sits outside a cabin and says nothing for a long while. His hands folded, his face turned toward the dark. Silence can mean fatigue. It can also mean witness. By 1660, the colony has not yet completed the full machinery of racial slavery as later generations will know it. But the path is no longer difficult to trace. Freedom has not vanished all at once. It has been narrowed, challenged, postponed, and inherited away. The final cruelty is not simply the theft of labour. It is the attempt to make that theft look permanent, reasonable, and ordinary. And that is what life was really like at the edge of this transformation. Not one long, simple nightmare, and not a world of equal uncertainty either. It was a place where some openings still existed while powerful people worked deliberately to seal them. A place where black families built meaning under pressure. A place where law, religion, economics, and daily custom slowly learned to cooperate in the service of racial bondage. A place where the future was being taken shape by shape, clause by clause, habit by habit, until the loss could be felt in nearly every corner of an ordinary life. Now the settlement grows quieter. Doors close. The river keeps moving in the dark. The fields wait for morning, and above it all, the stars look down on a colony becoming more ruthless, more organised, and more certain of its own injustice. The night softens at last. The sounds grow fewer now and gentler. Crickets continue their patient song in the grass, and the marsh answers with the low, sleepy murmur of frogs. Smoke from the hearths drifts thinly through the warm dark, carrying the fading scents of ash, grain, and wood. The houses become only shapes. The paths disappear into shadow. Even the river seems to hush itself, moving past the settlement with a slow, secret calm. You let the day loosen from your shoulders. The hard edges of the colony begin to blur in the darkness. The fields no longer demand labour. The courtrooms no longer speak. The docks no longer call for barrels and rope. What remains are smaller things. A mother settling a child beneath a blanket. A pair of tired hands resting at last. A quiet breath near a banked fire. A low prayer spoken into the room. Not for power, not for profit, but for rest. You stay with those human sounds somewhere. A lullaby drifts softly and then fades. Somewhere else. A door closes against the night air. The stars widen above the trees, cool and distant, and the earth beneath them slowly releases the heat it held all day. The world feels older now, quieter, almost suspended. The colony, for a few gentle hours, stops shouting its rules. And in that hush, you remember what endured. Not the voices of lawmakers, not the ledgers, not the commands. What endures is the stubborn warmth of people who kept caring for one another anyway. A hand on a shoulder, a whispered blessing, a memory carried across water and years, a song kept low in the dark, a child asleep, held close. So you let the smoke thin into the sky. You let the river carry off the noise of the day. You let the night gather all the sharpness and slowly smooth it down. The trees stand still. The stars remain. The fire sinks lower. And at last, in the deep quiet beyond the fields and the law and the fear, you rest beside the simple truth that even in a world growing crueler, human dignity did not disappear. It glowed softly, stubbornly, like the last red embers in the hearth.